please give us your assessment of the geopolitical situation today. I want to kind of make sure that we have at least a sense of where people stand on this question of what geopolitics look like. The last two U.S. administrations have talked about great power competition or the end of the post-Cold War era. But how do you characterize geopolitics, and what are the main risks and challenges? Let's go east to Minister Zardari.
Thank you for having me. I think that unfortunately geopolitics is reflecting a lot of domestic politics these days, where we see hyper polarization, hyper partisanship, both domestically all over the world, and now that is reflected in our geopolitics. And similarly, just as domestically, the normative, institutional, or democratic frameworks that are used to channel differences but reach consensus and conclusion are being stressed, fraught, undermined, rendered ineffective as a result of hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized politics at home. Similarly, the international order, the normative glue that held the world together, the institutional frameworks that channeled various different international views, but then sort of through the international institutions like the United Nations or other frameworks would come up with some sort of conclusion as a result, once again, of our hyperpartisanship, hyperpolarization. Those international institutions, those international normative frameworks, the way that we've been approaching the world has been fragmented, undermined, and as a result, we're seeing what we're seeing, both here in Europe, but also an increase in tensions everywhere. I don't think that the blame rests at any one country's door. I mean, I believe that whether it is sort of from the time of Iraq or otherwise, perhaps we ourselves also have undermined those international institutions. But whatever the reasoning, the old international order, the old normative order for us to, for our dispute resolutions has clearly failed. And as a result, you now see the first war in mainland Europe after the Second World War, which has global consequences. What we would like to see is obviously a return to a more institutional, normative functioning internationally, as well as domestically, so we could work together to solve issues. Here at WEF, I believe we're discussing, there's a lot of discussion about what the new world order will be, or how, even in the context of our new Helsinki, how do we work towards that new normative international order that allows us to address our differences and disputes as the civilized world. And I believe perhaps we are at the moment in such a hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized time that we're not going to be able to form that new Helsinki today. But I hope going forward we are able to do, I mean, we must form and improve our normative and international institutional order internationally so that we can address these complaints. I hope this time round, once we're building this new world order or new rules-based order, the voice of the global south and the developing world is included. Because we must understand that the way that the international order is constructed, whether it's international financial institutions or other international institutions, they were constructed by the West at the times of, colonialism, and when the world was a very different place. So to meet the challenges of today, and in order to construct an order that has the buy-in of the international world, we do hope that the global South has their voices heard, has their perspective included. And if we do go down that path, where you have not only the global North, but also the global South as stakeholders in a new international order, then there are higher chances that it'll be successful.
Minister Zardari, to talk a bit about Ukraine, it has understandably been a huge part of conversations here this week. The narrative about both the causes of the war, the fault in the war, and the consequences of the war in Europe and the United States. You have a somewhat different view on it. Tell us what the war looks like from where you sit.
Look, I think as far as support for international law, for the United Nations, for UN Security Council resolutions. I think I have a very similar view to everybody sitting on the stage. As far as the human tragedy, the humanitarian crisis, the loss of life, I think we all share exactly the same view. As far as the economic consequences, or the knock-on ripple effects of this colossal tragedy has had not only in Europe, but not only in the West, but all over the world. Gas prices have gone up in America, but they've also gone up in Pakistan. We've had food security, energy insecurity issues. I think the perspective that we come to, particularly from the South perspective, is that we don't see the Ukraine conflict as the first and only time that international law and the United Nations Security Council resolutions have been violated. We find it ironic that the UN applies in Ukraine, but not in Iraq. We find it sad that the United Nations Security Council resolutions that mean so much to all of Europe and all of the West right now mean nothing more than the paper that they're written on when it comes to the case of Kashmir. So I think that from that aspect, our perspectives are different. As a country that just we were part of the last forever war, our hope, our prayer is that this does not turn into the next forever war. So perhaps more so than those who were directly involved in this conflict, we hope that it is resolved sooner rather than later. We'd like to see a proactive approach from both sides to also pursue diplomacy in the pursuit of peace, while absolutely having to respond to the military elements of this conflict. I believe that diplomacy is the key thing that is missing. And what I would say to my Ukrainian friends would be that, NATO was in my neighborhood too. And we thought that they would be there till the last terrorist, and until that war was concluded. And ultimately, that conflict was resolved around a negotiating table. I feel we wasted much time because back in 2002, the Afghan Taliban were willing to surrender and negotiate, but we did not take that opportunity seriously and ended up having to do the same thing in 2022. I hope that eventually the space is created for some sort of dialogue and diplomatic engagement in order to resolve the conflict.
I want to turn in a moment to the forward-looking, constructive side of this, but Mr. Zardari, I'd also like you to respond to that interpretation.
I have
Is there anything you take issue with?
Just simple questions. There are two ways to achieve your objective. Say your objective is every inch of territory back in the hands of the Ukrainian people. It's some sort of NATO Article 5. Is it not even worth trying to achieve those same objectives through dialogue? Surely you can achieve those objectives through war and through conflict, but you could try to achieve them around the negotiating table. What's the worst that could happen? You'd fail and go back to war. But if you do manage to reach a consensus that covers all your concerns, but addresses some of the anxieties that the opposing sides might have, surely that's worth trying. From a perspective of a country that honestly just went through 20 years of conflict, who personally, I was on the side of this isn't over until we defeat every single last extremist or terrorist. And then the way I saw those events ultimately unfold, I would always advise, and this is constructive, friendly advice from somebody who's on your side, that while I understand the seriousness, the gravity, the challenge to Europe, I mean, I studied in the British system. I mean, we all grew up learning about World War II and all the aftermath and how much that must mean for everybody within Europe. I fail to understand why we can't simultaneously have some serious, responsible international players also trying to pursue a diplomatic resolution to a conflict.
Minister Zerdar, you talked about bringing the global south into a discussion of the international system, global rules. What would that change? What perspective would you bring that you think would change the basic tenets of the system?
Just quite frankly, I think the entire international order is constructed around the Western interests. And it was constructed at a time, a very sort of a sadder time in our history when colonialism was more of a reality. Many of the countries that exist today did not exist at the time the structure was set into place. I believe that the international order can only be empowered if were the inputs of Africa, Asia, China, India, the entire globe represented in this so-called order. And if you have the buy-in of everyone, then there's more of a chance of it to succeed. That everyone would also have to be those that you don't agree with. It would mean that we would have to compromise, others would have to compromise, but a truly successful system will be just that, a compromise that we could reach together.